So let me start by introducing myself, as you are all introducing yourselves in the chat. My name is Michelle Graff, and I own my own business, Cultivating Human Resiliency, and I've been doing that about 5 years. But before that, I have over 20 plus years providing direct service, as well as I had various positions in leadership. I did staff training and development for many years. I was in a leadership role in which I helped implement trauma-informed services within the agency I worked at. And in those 20 years, I learned a few things. The first was, and I think this is one of the most important things I learned, is just the healing power of connection. That everything we do, all the techniques we have, there's nothing more important than just two human beings being able to connect to each other. And that in itself is a compassionate intervention. The second thing I learned was that we don't focus nearly enough on resiliency. People have resilience, and acknowledging, recognizing that, understanding the contribution everybody has to give really does need to be our focus. And sometimes in our industries, we might talk about being strength-based, but I'm not sure we do it enough. I'm not sure we recognize enough the power of building on resiliency. And the second thing, or the third thing that I learned was that we, and by we, I mean the helping professionals, are really not any different from the people we work with. And that if we really want to be trauma informed, we need to start with ourselves. So about 5 years ago, I left my current position, I started my own business, and I now focus on helping professionals. I really think allowing people in this field to focus on themselves in terms of building their own resiliency, as well as understanding their own experiences with trauma and how that impacts how they respond in certain situations, is crucial to be able to provide services that are actually helping to strengthen our communities. So that's sort of where I come from in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today. I would like for you to come away from today's training just thinking about compassion fatigue a little bit differently. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go do a deep dive on all of the aspects that I'm going to cover today, but I want to just give you a different way of looking at it so that you can better focus on building your own resiliencies, restoring your own compassion so that we can be more compassionate for others. Whenever I do any kind of presentation on any topic, I always start with the brain. I really truly believe that the brain is that understanding the brain helps us to understand ourselves. To know our brain is to embrace our humanity. And then also it gives us the ability to acknowledge the humanity in others. The other reason I talk about the brain is because the brain is a wonderful working model for all living organisms. And so that means it relates to relationships as well as the organizations we work with, our communities. I really focus a lot on systems, and I think it's part of the topic of compassion fatigue that is sometimes ignored. We think of compassion fatigue as a problem for individuals. It really can impact our entire organizations and the systems we work in. And I believe it's important to have that understanding. Today, I'm going to focus on you, the helping professional, but part of what I work on when I work with organizations is looking systemically at how we can combat compassion fatigue. So I want you to kind of think about that as we go through our material today. Go over this part really quickly, but I'm just going to focus on a few different things about how the brain is designed. I call them design elements that really impact the topic of compassion fatigue as we're going to talk about it. And the first is, when we look at the brain, there's actually two developmental drivers, and you're probably all familiar with this, that who we are in terms of how our brain develops is part of the blueprint that's already been in our DNA. And that DNA sort of is the map or the blueprint that our development will follow if everything sort of goes as planned. But our development is also experience driven. In other words, what we experience in terms of the things that nurture or promote our development, as well as experiences like trauma that might either shift the way we develop, or it might impair the way we develop. But all of these things, all of our experiences, good and bad, are going to shape how we view the world and how our brain develops. And I think that's a real important factor to think of when we talk about our different responses. The second thing I want to make you aware of in terms of our brain is that there's two different goals in our brain development. Our goal is, or our brain is designed with the goal of survival. So a lot of the responses, a lot of things the brain does is to keep us alive. And that is to keep us away from threats and push us towards things that are life-sustaining. That's just in our design as human beings. But there's this second goal that the brain has, and that is to thrive. And by thrive, I mean heal, connect, learn, grow, all those things in life that are beyond survival. So our brain also has that goal in mind. What happens is, and by the way, the brain can do both these things at the same time. It's not we're either a survivor or a thriver. We are both. However, we can sometimes get a little bit stuck in survival mode. And when we have experienced a lot of threat in our lives, which, by the way, all of us experience some trauma of some sort within our life, sometimes the brain learns how to respond in a way that keeps us stuck in some of that survival thinking. And we'll talk a little more about that in a second. The other design element that I think it's important to understand is that the brain has a couple interpretation functions. The brain is constantly scanning for data, trying to figure out the world around us so that we can navigate it. And it makes use of a few different things in order to do that safely. One of the things is we have a role, there's a perception role. As we are gathering new data into the brain, as we're experiencing things in life, our brain is creating a worldview. It's taking that information and is generalizing it, and it's assimilating it into what we already know so that we know how to correctly navigate the world. And what happens is we develop sort of a worldview. However, that worldview, as we age, gets more powerful, particularly around age 10, that worldview it becomes a very crucial factor in how we begin to then take in new data and interpret new data. The second interpretive function is our emotions. Our emotions are used by the brain to tag memories and information so that it can create a map of how to navigate the world. So when we get a new information, or when we experience something new, oftentimes there's an emotion associated with it, and that helps the brain make a decision whether this is a threat, whether this is something I should move towards or move away from. And so emotions can be used that way. I like thinking of describing emotions as like a GPS system, and they work really well. Emotions are good. They're a useful thing. Assuming that we're operating under a GPS, if we're using that analogy, that has an updated mapping program and a strong connection to the satellite. That's how GPSs work. However, if any of you have ever used a GPS system in which the connection wasn't very good, or in which the map wasn't updated, or the mapping program, it can also steer us the wrong way. And that's sort of how I think about emotions. As long as we're attuned and connected to them, and we're operating in the present and not an old, outdated map, our emotions can be very helpful guideposts. But like perception, sometimes our past experiences can cloud how we interpret new information and how we respond to them. And then the last element of the brain design that I just want to touch on real quick, and we'll get to the compassion fatigue part, is the power of relationships. And part of that is just by design. We are designed to connect to each other, and we do that for both safety, protection, and also to help us with that thrive goal of being able to heal, be able to nurture, to be able to grow. We need each other. Okay, that's a really important role, and it's part of the design of how our brain responds to things. So those are just 4 things I want you to keep in mind. I know that was a very quick overview, but it will relate to what we're going to talk about when we talk about compassion fatigue. So the term compassion fatigue has been around for a while. It's not something new. And it's something that when we experience secondary trauma, and secondary trauma, as you probably all know, is the experience of somebody else's trauma. So it could be witnessing somebody else's trauma. It also could be just hearing the stories. In many of our professions, in working with others, we listen to their stories and listen to their stories of trauma. And what we know is the effect of secondary trauma to our body and to the brain is very similar to the effect of primary trauma. Our brain doesn't distinguish the two. When it's taking in information about trauma, it doesn't always distinguish the difference between secondary and primary trauma. And so the symptoms of being exposed to secondary trauma or experiencing secondary trauma by being exposed to the trauma of others are the same as experiencing the trauma ourselves. They mirror each other very much. Compassion fatigue is a condition that happens when we are chronically experiencing secondary trauma, coupled with this high stress and burnout that comes along with the difficult work that we do. And it also, we want to factor in the primary trauma that's also associated with the work we do. Not everything's secondary trauma. Sometimes in the work we're doing, the trauma is a firsthand trauma that we're experiencing. We deal with and experience some very traumatic things. So that's what compassion fatigue is. And I'm going to just talk briefly about the symptoms of compassion fatigue. We're not going to, you are probably familiar with them, but I want to talk about this because sometimes it creates a aha moment for people when they realize, okay, maybe that is what's going on with me. Could this be compassion fatigue? But I want to today also go past just the symptoms and talking about what compassion fatigue is and talking about how it impacts us and maybe even touch on some ideas of how best to respond, or at least give you a direction of how best to respond for compassion fatigue. I will at the end also give you some information on some more ways to learn more about this topic. So since our brain is interpreting the work we do, the compassionate work we do, as a traumatic experience, because we work with people who have also experienced trauma, and so we're experiencing secondary trauma, our responses are going to fall into the normal threat responses of fight or flight or freeze. Oftentimes when you see lists of symptoms of compassion fatigue, they're divided into arousal and intrusion or avoidance. And those are just other labels for our fight and flight response or our freeze response, because our brain is interpreting the work we do as a threat. And if you are a particularly empathetic person or compassionate person, although that's a very good thing, for doing the kind of work that we all do, it also creates a vulnerability because we become more connected to that traumatic experience. And our brain is going to tell us, hey, this hurts. I think this is threatening to you, and I'm going to keep you safe by either moving you away from this, by mobilizing you to fight it, or by just shutting it off. And so many of the symptoms that people describe as compassion fatigue is really that numbing feeling, or that feeling like they're depleted of compassion. I am all out of compassion. I have nothing more to give. And a lot of that is our brain really saying, okay, we need to stop this. Okay, it's sensing that there is something threatening to our well-being. When we look at symptoms, I always like to look at not just the emotional aspect, but also the cognitive aspect, what we're thinking, how we're processing information, and our physical. Our body is going to respond in fight, flight, and freeze, as well as our thoughts and our feelings. So this is just a general list. I'm not going to read this to you, but it's sort of divided into our fight and flight response, or another way of putting that is our responses of mobilization or our responses of freeze or immobilization. And I divided it into cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, and physical symptoms. And I want you to just take a second and look at that list and see if you recognize any that you've been experiencing. And if you feel comfortable, go ahead and put in the chat if there's any of those symptoms that you recognize in yourself. Okay. So I want to talk to you now about what that really is, or thinking about how our brain's responding. I think this really helps us to have an understanding. I use an analogy of the circuit breaker in my home. This is actually a picture of a circuit breaker. In fact, this might even be mine. It looks like mine. If any of you are familiar with your house, you know that in your basement or somewhere, there's a box with all the circuits that operates or sends the electricity throughout your home. I'm not an electrician, so I might be describing this wrong. But one of the things I know and that I've experienced is if I have too many appliances running at once, it'll trip the breaker and all the power will shut off. Now, if I didn't understand what was going on, I might mistakenly think that when that breaker trips, that I'm out of power. Okay, the power's gone, it's empty, I ran out. And that's not what's happening at all. In fact, if you go down to your basement or wherever your circuit box is, and you flip the switch, it'll restore the power. What's happening is the reason why we have breaker boxes is they're for safety. If they sense that there is any sort of danger or risk in terms of the electrical wires being overloaded, they're going to shut off that power so that everything's safe. And all you need to do is unplug a few things and go back and flip that switch, and then power is restored. It's running again. And I think that's a good analogy for what happens with compassion fatigue. When it feels like we're running out of compassion, we're not. Okay. What's happening is we have flipped or tripped a breaker somewhere in our brain that's saying, okay, we need to shut this down right now. This is feeling unsafe. Okay. And so when you think about your symptoms of compassion fatigue, I want you to think of this analogy. And you're not out of compassion, but what you do need to do is unplug a few things and reset the breaker. And that's really going to be one of our first steps when we talk about how to combat compassion fatigue, is being able to understand when we need to reset. So there's two things I want you to remember about compassion as it's associated with compassion fatigue. The first is compassion is not a finite resource. It is replenishable. We cannot be out of compassion. It can always be replenished. Okay. What feels like we're out of compassion is just our need to reset. The second thing I want you to remember is that although it could be part of what makes us vulnerable, compassion is actually the antidote. So this sounds sort of counterintuitive. If compassion is what's making us flip that switch, then how could it possibly be the antidote? Well, think of it like that power. It's not the electricity that's causing the problem. It's the overloaded wire that's causing the problem. Actually getting the electricity back on is our next step, and getting our compassion to not only return or be replenished so that we can be compassionate for others, but also so that we can benefit from that healing effect of compassion. There's a lot of research now being done on compassion, and it not only has a healing effect on those that are recipients of compassion, but there's a lot of evidence that when we respond compassionately, it also has a healing effect, and it also has benefits to ourselves. When we notice suffering and then we take action to respond to that suffering, we are sending a signal back to our brain and to our threat response saying, we got this, everything's okay. So even just thinking about being compassionate actually can be part of the antidote that helps us to restore compassion and to combat compassion fatigue. And I'm going to talk about this a little deeper. I don't want to just be theoretical today. I want to give you some practical insight. But if you're interested in more information about compassion, I believe it's Stanford that has an entire program that's studying and doing a lot of research on the healing effects of compassion, how to renew or replenish compassion. And there's a lot of, they're really mounting a lot of good evidence. Not that I think we needed research to tell us that it's a good thing to be compassionate, but I think there's some interesting things we can learn from that. Okay, so when I talk about combating compassion fatigue in my workshops, I focus on a few different things. And the first, starting in the center, it begins with self-awareness and self-regulation. Self-awareness being understanding what's going on with us when we're experiencing compassion fatigue, recognizing the symptoms so we know when to reset. And then self-regulation is that skill set involved in being able to reset, being able to get back to safety or back to regulation. The other things around the outside of that wheel are habits that when we practice or when we embed into our routine can help strengthen our resiliency to compassion fatigue. So we are not going to get into all of those today because we're not going to have time, but I want to point them out. And a couple things I want to point out. One is you can see that self-care is on there. There's a lot of talk about self-care. It's sort of a buzzword nowadays. But I want to emphasize that self-care is only one piece of that pie. And self-care is really about making sure that we are also compassionate to ourselves. Most of what I see people do in the name of self-care is actually numbing, and it's disconnective. Good self-care is something we do routinely that reconnects us. Okay. And so we're not going to be able to really get into that, but I just wanted to point that out. I think we fall into the trap sometimes, and organizations that I work with sometimes promote self-care, which is a good thing. But I want you to remember that it's not to say that it's all on you to combat your compassion care or your compassion fatigue. And I think that's one of the dangers of putting too much emphasis on self-care, because compassion fatigue is something that is not just the problem of the individual. Like I said before, it can be the problem of systems as well as organizations. And the remedy, compassion, takes more than one person to restore compassion. It's really something we all need to be doing together. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to move on to the next slide. And when we talk about self-awareness, I want you to be thinking about what fight, flight, and freeze look like in our body, in our emotions, in our thoughts, and then also in our relationship responses. Because we're not just when we are impacted by compassion fatigue, it's also going to impact all of our relationships, and in that way has a rippling effect. And so we want to be able to recognize what fight, flight, and freeze look like in our interactions. It's also one of the reasons why we see organizations that are suffering from compassion fatigue. Because when you have individuals within the organizations that are constantly being exposed to trauma and experiencing secondary trauma, then they are interacting with each other in a way that's impacting the whole organization. Organizations themselves have their histories of trauma, histories of experiencing secondary trauma, as well as in some cases, in a lot of systems, the organization has a history of being adding to the traumatic experiences of others. And I think that's something we need to acknowledge if we're going to heal not just individuals, but heal our communities. So I want to talk a little bit about our physical response to trauma. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our nervous system. If anyone's ever familiar with polyvagal theory, which was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, if you want to do further reading, he really gets into he's done a lot of research on the nervous system, including our autonomic nervous system, which sort of has two halves to them. Sorry, I have a kitty cat here, which is the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So I like to think of these as the sympathetic nervous system is our response of mobilization. The parasympathetic is our response of rest and digest. It's often called rest and digest because we get back to regulation. When our sympathetic nervous system is triggered, our body is going to respond by getting ready to be mobilized. So things like increased breathing, increased heart rate, constricted muscles. It's going to inhibit some of the less needed or less urgent functions of the body, like your digestive functions. And it's also going to divert all its blood flow to the larger muscle systems so we can run, so we can fight, so we can defend ourselves. This is what we call our sympathetic or our mobilization response. The parasympathetic is the opposite of that. That's the response of regulation, of homeostasis. Our other digestive systems, our other cognitive abilities are going to come back online when this response is triggered. You know, our heart rate's going to lower and our breathing will relax. What happens is, though, as we're all becoming more aware of this, I hear and see a lot of things that might make you think that the parasympathetic response is good and the sympathetic response is bad, and that we just need to trigger our parasympathetic response. Well, that's not always the case, because actually neither of these are bad. It's normal regulation. We go back and forth. Our nervous system is designed to go back and forth from mobilization and rest. In fact, I think about it, you can't always be in a restful state. We need to be immobilized. It's how we get things done. So the sympathetic nervous system isn't necessarily a bad thing. What happens, though, is when we get triggered all the way into a fight and flight response, and when that happens too easily. Okay, so if you can see my little cursor here, a normal regulated response goes back and forth nicely. There are many times we are mobilized. In fact, emotionally, I would say love and courage are emotions of the sympathetic nervous system. But before we get into fight and flight. On the other side, though, is our freeze response, which is another survival response. And that is sort of the extreme of immobilization. Okay. And that happens when either our brain is interpreting, sorry about the cat, when our brain is interpreting that we are not equipped for the whatever it's distinguished as a threat, or it's an over response to our fight and flight response. We're in fight and flight, and then we get triggered to the other side. I like to think of it as a continuum, but please know that you can be experiencing fight and flight and then very quickly be in freeze, because when we get overwhelmed with fight and flight, we tend to go to freeze. So it's not necessarily something that happens, we either have freeze responses or we have fight and flight responses. If something is distinguished as a threat, we can have both. And it's this area in between in which we have regulation. So when we have a threat response triggered, what we want, the way we reset, is to restore safety or restore that sense of safety. So it might involve triggering the parasympathetic nervous system if we're in fight and flight, but it also might involve connecting if we are in freeze. And so when we think about how we regulate, we want to make sure that we are doing things, that we have resources that are both calming and connecting, because we want to get into this middle. What happens though when our system is chronically threatened, so either because we've experienced developmental trauma, or we're in situations where we're continually putting ourselves into stressful situations without relief, and we are chronically being exposed, or we are chronically experiencing secondary trauma, what happens is these lines tend to narrow. And so our area of regulation begins to narrow, and it doesn't take as much to trigger us into fight and flight or in freeze. And we find ourselves being less regulated, or regulated less often, and more often experiencing symptoms of fight or flight or freeze. Now, fight, flight, and freeze doesn't just happen in our body and in our body responses. It also happens in our limbic system, because our nervous system is intertwined and interconnected. So in our emotional response, fight and flight tend to look like anger and anxiety, and all the sub emotions that fall into those categories and really anger is a fight response emotionally, and anxiety is a flight response emotionally. And our freeze response then becomes numbing, or what we might categorize as depression. Depression is so much more, as you probably know, than being sad. In fact, you can be sad and be emotionally regulated. Okay. When we are emotionally regulated, we're feeling lots of feelings. There are many emotions that have many nuances, and we're aware of and experiencing all of them, or we have the ability to experience all of them while we're regulated. What happens when we're in a freeze response is we begin to numb those emotions. And it's really hard to selectively numb emotions. So as you numb the threatening emotions, you also start to numb the positive ones too. And so emotionally can be another way that we're experiencing our triggered threat responses. And again, that becomes more narrow the more chronically we're exposed. When we talk about emotions, they are not only responses, like when we talk about anxiety, anger and anxiety, and numbing and depression, they also can be the trigger. emotions in themselves, because they are coded with different experiences, can be a threatening trigger to our system or to our amygdala. And so they can actually provoke a survival response or a threat response. And these are just examples of some emotions that can be triggering to us. And some of them, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we don't have time, but one of the ones I want to talk about is shame. Shame is a very common universal emotion. People think of shame often as something associated with low self-esteem, and it's not. And I want to say that because even if you can have a good, healthy self-esteem and still experience shame. And I think it's important that we can acknowledge that, because what shame is, it's a feeling that comes along with not belonging or not being worthy of belonging. So it's definitely a part of our self-worth, but it's also the opposite of shame is actually belonging. And as human beings, belonging is one of our essential needs, along with our need for autonomy and our need for competency, our ability to do something. Belonging is the third major need that we have. And when we experience things like rejection, and these are universal experiences. Everybody at some time or the other has experienced rejection. That's going to trigger a response of shame or feeling like you don't belong. And the reason why I bring this up when I talk to helping professionals is because the nature of the work we do sometimes puts us in relationships that by nature are not reciprocated. So we're constantly experiencing a type of rejection in which we're reaching out to connect, and there's not always, just by nature of our relationship, that same kind of reciprocation. And so I think there's a high level of vulnerability to experience shame, but it's rarely recognized and called out. And it's almost as if we're ashamed to be ashamed. But I think any of these feelings, once we can identify them and what those triggering feelings are, we go a long way to be able to manage them. Because the feelings are temporary experiences. They're also a part of being a human being. So it's something that's universal. Okay, I want to move on to our thoughts, because I'm trying to get as much of this in as we can. Our thoughts also can be triggered when we see our fight and flight responses cognitively. It's going to look like defensiveness, as well as some cognitive distortions that occur. And those are our fight and flight responses cognitively. Our freeze responses are going to be things like denial, dissociation, minimizing. Those are going to be the type of cognitive freeze responses. One of the things I like to talk about is something I call mind traps. And these are devices of our brain that help keep us safe that sometimes can keep us stuck. And one is our brain has an automatic negativity bias. It is designed to keep us safe by noticing threats. And we notice threats. We'll have the tendency to see something as a threat, and overgeneralize things into a threat, as opposed to not noticing the threat, because our brain knows that what we don't know can hurt us. So it is going to have automatically a negativity bias. The more often we're triggered into survival mode, the greater that negativity bias is going to be. And I think that's important to recognize, because if we want to focus on resiliency, we're going to have to counteract that. The other thing is our survival brain distorts time. It slows time down. So there's so much more emphasis on traumatic experiences and things that are in the past. So being able to recognize and distinguish what is in the past and what is current is very important, but a skill that is difficult to develop because our survival brain will keep tripping us up. We tend to put too much weight on things that happened in the past. The third mind trap is a scarcity bias. Because the survival brain needs to triage all our resources, it sees everything as finite. What happens though is we get the trap or the tendency of seeing things that are replenishable as finite. And the example I already gave is compassion. Our brain's going to tell us that you need to conserve your compassion. Okay, you can't be compassionate to everyone. It's a finite resource. You're going to run out. And that's not the truth. It's a replenishable resource. It's a mind trap. And the last one is that polarized or extreme view, that the false dichotomies, the idea that something either has to be, that's either this or it's that, when it can be both. And that kind of polarized or extreme thinking makes us fall into the traps of things like either I am a compassion giver or I'm a compassion recipient, when we're both. It's one of the things that polarizes our view of the world and creates that us against them mentality. That is our brain polarizing things. And it does this because in survival mode, it's easier to make decisions if things are clear and there's no vagueness or nuances. However, in reality, for us to thrive, we need to be able to see the nuances of things and understand that we can be both compassion distributors as well as compassion recipients. And one of the problems of these sort of mind traps is when we're in helping professions, we start to get that sort of sense that we have to triage things all the time. I don't know about all of you. I'm going to share an experience I have, and you can tell me or see if you relate to it. I'm in a book club, and oftentimes we'll read books in which the protagonist in the book will experience something traumatic, or maybe have a traumatic childhood or something like that. And because I've worked in child welfare for so many years and seen so many just horrific things, I tend to minimize that. And I find myself saying things like, well, that's not so bad, or, oh, I've seen worse than that, as if somebody that's experienced trauma is not deserving of compassion because their trauma isn't as bad as somebody else's. And now I can recognize that that's a distortion and that that's not true, but I have to check myself, because this way of thinking, because of my experiences, that's been distorted a little with me. And maybe you can all relate to that we tend to do that. We tend to triage things and feel like one thing might be more deserving of attention or compassion than others. And really, there's no compassion is replenishable resources. There's no need to do that. So I just want to real briefly go over this concept and where some of these stuck mindsets can come from. So a mind trap, as I just told you, those are sort of devices that our brain has to help us when we're in a traumatic moment that can sometimes get us stuck. A mindset is a pattern of belief that we've developed over time. And when we've experienced trauma, and when we're constantly experiencing trauma, there can be a pervasive belief and a protective belief that develops over time. And I just want to talk about it real briefly so that you can recognize it. I have other trainings to get into this much deeper, but a traumatic experience is when there's an external threat in which we lack the external resources and internal resources to cope with. Okay? That's how we define a traumatic experience. Everybody has experienced trauma probably at some time or another in their life. When we think about that in terms of those basic human needs that I talked about before, that we need to have that sense of autonomy or over our own life, that we need to feel that we belong, and particularly belong to a protective community, and that we need to feel that we're competent, you can see why a trauma can be such a threatening thing to what we consider safety, or how a traumatic experience can remove us from that sense of safety, because it's something that's beyond our control. It's an experience in which your protective community failed you, and that's not to assign blame, but you didn't have the external resources to cope with it at the time, and you also weren't able to self-protect. So it is a threat to both our sense of autonomy, our sense of belongingness, and our sense of competency. And so over time, the pervasive belief that can develop is that the world is uncontrollable and unsafe. My community won't protect me. Maybe we even think I'm unworthy of belonging, and I'm unable to protect myself. Well, if this is your pervasive belief, the world is a very scary place. So we can't really survive with that pervasive belief. So we have to develop a protective belief. And that is, I must be in control. My worth needs to be validated so I can belong. And somebody else is responsible for fixing it or what happened. That sort of, I'm not able to protect myself, so someone else is going to need to take care of it. This protective belief over time can really get us caught in a stuck mindset that makes it more difficult to deal with conflict, to deal with interpersonal relationships, and sometimes to deal with problem solving or getting out of situations. So this is where it comes from. Okay, that idea that, and I bet everybody in here at some time or another, when they're triggered or feeling threat, gets a little controlling, or really is seeking out some validation from other people, or just gives up at times and doesn't want to take responsibility for either our healing or for our role in what we need to do or the action we need to take. We probably all can think of times when we've experienced this, but when this protective belief overtakes that pervasive belief, it can be problematic. The reason why I'm pointing that out is because that impacts our relationships. I want to talk about our relationship responses, and I have a question, so I'm going to stop right here. Oh, somebody asked about the recording. I'll talk about that as we get to the end. How you can get more information, how we can make this recording available, and we are almost at the end, so I need to talk fast. I'm going to continue through this, and then I will stop at the end, and I'll answer all of those questions. So oftentimes you might be familiar with this, the persecutor, victim, rescuer response that we call the trauma triangle, or originally it was the drama triangle, developed in the 60s by Stephen Cartman, I believe. But we use this sometimes in trauma-informed care to explain relationship responses. And one of the things I want to emphasize, these are not labels. When we talk about victim, persecutor, rescuer, these are how we're responding. All of us can respond in all three of these ways when we're triggered. What these are is they're really our fight, flight, and freeze responses. So when we talk about a persecutor response, which can include things like, our persecutor response can include things like using coercion, labeling people as a persecutor response. Anytime we're trying to control them, threats are persecutor responses. That's a fight response. We've all done that in relationships. We've all at one time or another been triggered and resorted to even guilt trips to some extent are fight responses. We're trying to push the responsibility onto someone else. When we talk about the rescuer responses, we're really talking about flight responses. And remember, we're not talking about when somebody is being victimized. We're talking about when somebody's stuck in a victim role or a victim type of thinking, which is our freeze response. Okay. When we respond out of flight, it's usually because there's an uncomfortable emotion that we're trying to flee. Okay. So when we do things that's not our responsibility to do, when we see ourselves as rescuing or helping somebody or doing for them, it's because there's an uncomfortable emotion being triggered. Rescuing response can also be things like avoiding conflict or pacifying people, or not allowing them, withholding information because we're afraid that they'll have an emotional response that we're uncomfortable with. So and as helping professionals, sometimes we're sort of forced into this rescuer role, and we need to be aware or stop and be aware of our own feelings and ask yourself, am I responding this way because there's an emotional situation that I'm uncomfortable with? And so what we want to do is learn how to respond in ways that are outside this triangle, or I like to use the terms responding like a learner, a coach, or an ally. A coach uses, instead of coercion, uses options. An ally supports the efforts of someone else, but distinguishes what's their role and what's the other person's role. A learner seeks out what they need to know or what they need to learn how to do, what they're not able to do yet. These are healthier roles and healthier ways to interact because they recognize the boundaries of what we can and can't do. This is something with helping professionals that they very easily can get caught into this trap. And learning how to recognize it and stay out of it, learning how to set clear boundaries can be crucial in being able to continue to restore compassion and be compassionate individuals and be effective in the work we do. So again, just being able to recognize what your personal relationship responses are is the first step. The next step is self-regulation. And I already mentioned this before. When we learn about self-regulation, we want to make sure that we are not just doing calming things. Calming things can be good. I mean, certainly doing deep breathing and things that that trigger our parasympathetic response can be very helpful. But sometimes we need to do connective things because sometimes we're triggered into freeze. So we want to have resources that are both calming and connective. By top down and bottom up, what I'm referring to as top down is when we engage our prefrontal lobe to respond in a way that calms the limbic system. Bottom up is when we do physical responses that actually can trigger the rest of our nervous system. So bottom up would be things like deep breathing. And by the way, deep breathing exercises actually can be both calming and connective because it's the exhale that calms us, but the inhale actually can connect us. So breathing is a very good balanced, learning how to do healthy deep breathing is a good balanced activity. I'm not going to be able to go into all the different regulation resources. I just wanted to point out that we want to make sure that we have options in all these categories so that we can be aware when we need to do something that is, say, top-down calming versus something that is bottom-up connecting, and based on how we are triggered or how we are responding. An example of a top-down activity that is connective and can also sometimes be calming is just simply naming the emotion. We talk a lot about processing in my workshops, but even just identifying what you're feeling in the moment, doing that can connect us. It's also naming an emotion actually is utilizing our frontal lobe to be able to name the emotion. That might not be where we're feeling it, but that actually then can send that signal of safety back to our amygdala. When we do the things on the outside of the circle, what we also want to do is not just reset, but we want to focus on actually expanding our area, or you call this is our range of regulation so that we are less easily triggered. Okay, it's not about removing stress from our lives, by the way. Stress is a part of life. We're supposed to have a little bit of stress. It's about not being triggered by that stress. And sometimes you need to first reset, but then there are also things that can build that resiliency. So we're broadening our tolerance for some of those stressors. And again, this is back to, it is 12 o'clock and I've come full circle, and I promised you I'd talk about different ways. I'm not going anywhere, so please don't log off if you can stay on. There's 3 different ways you can learn more. One, you can follow me on Facebook, and Cultivating Human Resiliency is the name of my company, because I do lots of workshops. I'm hoping to do a virtual summit coming up. There'll be lots more learning opportunities for you. The second is that if you work for an organization and you would like me to come work for your organization or come present there, go to my website, resiliencyonline.com, and there's a way to connect. The third way is I do have a book that covers all of this in much more detail, and it's on Amazon, and you're welcome to check that out. It's not a long read. It's about 160 pages. So, but it really goes into a little more detail, some of this information.